Party has determined that it's the right time to start. So we are starting. It's 30 minutes past 3 p.m. in the afternoon, the time that and if you're here for the event on accessing the GCF and lessons from evaluation, you're in the right event. The title is a bit of a lie, though. We might look at evidence on accessing the GCF, but not just from evaluations, but also from the perspective of the private sector, and but evaluations from different perspectives, bilateral agencies as well as multilateral development banks besides the GCF. But before we get started, maybe if you want to move up, we have a lot of room in the room, and you can be more face to face with the panel and pick their brains a little bit more. And we can have a more intimate conversation about accessing the GCF. Yeah, time for that is long. That's it. So, before I introduce the very distinguished panel today, let's just maybe take a minute to get to know ourselves in the room, who we are as a collective. It's a very we've all come from different parts of the world, but who we represent and in what capacity we are here at the COP. So if we could have a show of hands, perhaps, for any government representatives here in the room. Government representatives, one, and that's it. Which government would you?
Jamaica Social Investment Fund. So,
Government of Jamaica. You said that with some amount of doubt. And
Kyrgyzstan.
So we've got two developing country government colleagues here in the room. Any colleagues from entities, direct access entities of the GCF? We've got that corner is the direct access entity, corner of the GCF. Any international entities? Academia? CSOs? Academia. I was just about to come to academia. I also identified as an academic in a previous life, and that's my favorite corner. Then academics. You're from the academia. What other sectors are represented in the room, sir?
I'm from the private sector. I work for a company called Tetra Tech.
Private sector. Any other private sector colleagues in the room? Private sector. Other multilateral funds, adaptation fund. Fantastic. Okay, so we've got a fair bit of diversity in the room, a fair bit of interest in access to the GCF and access to climate finance in the room. What we access to climate finance and access to the GCF is written in the DNA of the GCF. GCF is founded to provide access to climate finance through international and direct access entities. But 7 years into the functioning of the GCF, we're still drawing lessons on access. We're still learning a lot about how access works and what makes it work and what's the best way to make it work. This afternoon, let's spend about 90 minutes to talk about access to the GCF, international or national, and what lessons we're drawing from various different lenses. So we've got a very distinguished set of panelists here with us, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they're sitting towards my left. So the first speaker today is Mr. Andres Struyman. He's the head of Independent Evaluation Unit at the Green Climate Fund. Andres has been with the GCF for more than 4 years now. And before coming to the GCF, he was with the C4, the Center for International Forestry in Indonesia. He's got experience in impact monitoring systems for large research for development programs. And he has a degree in economics from the University of Copenhagen. By the way, our entire panel, all of our panel members have degrees in economics. So you'll hear that in the next couple of minutes a lot from me. Our next panel member is Alexandra. Alexandra, that's my task. Alexandra, I just checked her name a few seconds before our panel started, and I'm going to get it wrong. Quite again. Perfect. She's an evaluator with the German with DEVAL, and has previously worked with the GIZ on ecosystems-based adaptation. She has degrees in geography and economics at the from Heidelberg, Santiago de Chile, Bonn. She's worked previously with BMZ as well and the Center for European Economic Research. Thank you for joining us, Alexandra. Our next panel member is going to be from the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Theo Sands. Theo is a principal and an evaluation manager with the evaluation department at the EBRD. Their department is making evaluations useful and used by conducting high quality and independent evaluation to strengthen accountability and evidence-based decision making. Theo personally has focused on green transitions, climate, solar energy, and the energy sector, broadly speaking, for the bank. He's previously been a consultant and has degrees from the Hardy School of Governance and University of Oxford. Thank you, Theo, for taking the time to speak with us today. And last but not the least, Margaret Ann Swan. She's very familiar to us in the GCF. Margaret Ann Swan is the private sector observer to the GCF. She's the executive director of CMIA, Climate Market and Investment Association. She's a fellow also at the Royal Geographical Society. Margaret has 20 years of experience in financial markets and has a degree in economics from the London School of Economics. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us and for taking the time to speak with us. First and foremost, let me come to Andres and request him to give us a sense of the lessons we're learning from evaluations that the independent evaluation unit has done on the various access modalities of the GCF and what lessons we can draw from the various evaluations, including of accreditation, direct access, private sector, SAP, the Simplified Approval Process, the RFP, and what are some of the challenges in accessing the GCF particularly. Andres.
Thank you, Archie, and also a warm welcome from my end. It's great to see so many people being interested in learning. The GCF is truly a learning organization, so I'm really proud for that particular reason that at the GCF we are able to ask critical questions and also present certain findings in a very critical way. I was asked and tasked with a very massive task to look at access at the GCF, and I tried to, we've done at the GCF, at the IEU, several syntheses where we tried to synthesize across the different evidences that we've got from evaluations. And I've brought with me today one slide, and I assure you it will only be one slide. And it is one slide with 3 key messages that I want you to see and hear about with regards to access. And so basically, as Archie has alluded to, we have several, we've done several evaluations with different lenses and different questions, but most often access is one of the topics that we are assessing in all of our evaluations. So here, 3 points, 3 key points that I really want to make. And the first one, and apologies, you see 4 there, but you will see what I mean with 3 because it's basically interlinked. So the first one is on accreditation. And here the evaluation team found throughout the different evaluations that we've done that despite the high level recognition of the importance of entities for the GCF lacks a strategy for accrediting them. And when you look at the updated strategic plan of the GCF, it highlights the importance of the accredited entities, but it has not resulted in the preparation of the preparation and implementation of a strategy for accreditation, and that we find to be a huge gap for the GCF. This is coming from a synthesis that we've presented earlier this year to the board, the first board meeting of the year. Since then, the board has addressed this by at least approving a strategy now in the very last board meeting. So we do have a strategy now from the GCF, but it is yet to be implemented. So we're finding it's still difficult to fully understand as evaluators of what the GCF is trying to do with accredited entities, what sort of partners we want to partner with, why, and for what purpose, basically, and how many. Without it, and this is to say here, without it, the GCF lacks clarity on what it wants to do with the partners, and that may also have implications on the programmatic alignment between the accredited entities and the GCF. So we know from our work here, the GCF, that the GCF uses several tools for planning. One is the country programming that helps the planning for the countries and to identify potential projects and strategies for the country. And there's also entity work programs that are usually meant to be for the entities to get a better understanding of what they could be putting forward in terms of projects. Both of these products are used to a very insufficient level at the GCF. So it's not every entity, and if they have them, they tend to not use them after they finalize these plans. Secondly to this, the process of accreditation is considered protracted and inefficient. So to give you a number here, and I wrote it down, the median time for entities to receive board approval for accreditation has increased, and it has in fact increased to 1,321 days on average. That's a little over 3.5 years. And that's a concern in particular when we look at the question of climate urgency. So let me come to a second point that I wanted to make here, and that is the point on accredited entities, and here in particular, direct access. So we, as an evaluation team, we looked at the different categories for accredited entities. And here at the fund, we're basically categorizing as follows. We're categorizing in international accredited entities and direct access entities. I should say here on a very positive note, the evaluation team found that direct access is growing. So during the GCF1 period, so meaning during 2020 and 2021, that's the period we used for our evaluation because we're currently in 2022, direct access entities comprise nearly 66% of all accreditation approvals. And that is, we think that's a good story. It's a good story to tell that more direct access entities have been accredited. While funding, the funding approved through direct access entities has also increased to 23% from previously 12% in the initial resource mobilization period. That was the initial period that we had. We're now in the GCF1 period. Again, there's also an increase in programming. But direct access in general remains limited. The GCF portfolio overall is skewed heavily towards international accredited entities, and the evidence from the two periods that we looked at finds a lack of capacity is constraining direct access entity efficiency in delivering climate finance. So we clearly see a linkage between the accredited entities that we're having on board here at the GCF and their ability to bring projects forward, and the lack of sufficient support for capacity. So to illustrate that, 66% of accredited direct access entities do not have funding proposals with the GCF, and 20% of those do not even have a concept note, so have never actually conceptualized an idea with the GCF. And that's a concern. Linked to this, and this does come no surprise, the effectiveness of RPSP and PPF is not well known. So RPSP, again, apologies for the abbreviations, is the Readiness and Preparatory Support Program of the GCF. PPF is the Project Preparation Facility. Both are funds that are available for those that require capacity support. That's financial support for capacity training. And so the effectiveness is not well known, and that is also due to the fact that we have no monitoring systems in place for those programs to better understand of how well they're working, for whom, and how much. Again, we can note there is an integrated results management framework that looks at projects and results management for projects, but it falls short when when it should be when we think about support programs. So my last point here, and that goes to coverage. The accredited entity coverage and the access to meet GCF objectives and to match the programming gaps and needs in countries has not been operationalized. So we find that there are some gaps here, and it goes as follows. So the IEU analysis shows that only 37% of the GCF eligible countries have direct access entity coverage. 37% of the GCF eligible countries have direct access entities. The rest does not. The number of the GCF private sector direct access entities, so those entities that could bring forward private sector projects, remains very small. It's only 7 out of the 28 direct access entities that we will have. So it's very, very low. That's not to say that the GCF cannot have other private sector projects, but currently the GCF explains private sector projects through the accredited entity that applies for the project. There's obviously also projects that could come from the public sector that engage the private sector heavily, but those are not considered private sector projects. At least there's no clarity in the GCF that those could be considered and counted as private sector projects. So while more private sector funding has gone to the direct access entities than to the public sector counterparts, the resources are concentrated to a very small number of direct access entities. So here you see again that we have, when we look at the bulk of direct access entities, we have a lot of programming that's happening, but that's concentrated and clustered around a very few, a small set of direct access entities that can perform with the GCF, predominantly regional direct access entities. So I hope I managed this in four minutes or so. Apologies for taking a little bit longer. Thanks. Back to you, Archie.
Thank you, Andres. Andres, you spoke of challenges to access in the GCF. You've spoken about capacity as a challenge. You've spoken of limitations of access. And one dimension that you spoke about relates to the thing that I'm very curious to hear from Alexandra about vulnerability. And you've done some work, Alexandra, on vulnerability as a driver for allocation and how that might relate to allocation of finance in general. But what's been your experience in terms of allocation patterns to address developing country needs and partner needs? And if you can speak also about mobilizing private sector finance related to climate change.
Great, thank you. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me? It doesn't sound like that. Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Archie. And let me just briefly present our institute. So DIVA is the German Institute for Development Evaluation. We are an independent federal research institute mandated to evaluate German ODA, not only on climate change, but also on other topics on a strategic level, so not project and program level, as a basis for evidence-based learning and for holding also ODA accountable. So likewise, there's a lot of critical discussions, and I'm happy to have them jointly. And although we did not evaluate MDBs or access to the GCF, I hope to add value to this discussion by sharing some of the findings on drivers of German adaptation finance allocation as part of a very comprehensive evaluation that we started in 2018 already, which was structured in very different topics. As Germany is one of the biggest bilateral donors in the DAC environment on CCA, so to address those complexity and comprehensiveness. And so, well, we might have some similarities, but also differences of the findings. And also, just to note that, I'm replacing a colleague of mine who is unfortunately COVID positive today. So if there's further questions, also happy to reach out. So on the needs orientation of German adaptation finance, supporting countries and people most affected by climate change is one of the main objectives of German development cooperation, also written strategies in the field of climate change adaptation. In our evaluation, however, we expected that the poorest partner countries and the small island developing states would receive over proportionally high levels of per capita funds for adaptation measures. And the good news here is we found that climate vulnerability indeed increases the probability of partner countries to receive German commitments. We look for German commitments, not for disbursements. However, and that is perhaps the not so good news, we also found out that the level of vulnerability is not related to the sum of commitments. So while countries receive above average commitments, others receive below average based on their vulnerability status. And among them are highly vulnerable countries and SIDS. Furthermore, we also found that there is donor herding, a concentration of donors in certain types of countries, meaning there are also in the topic of climate change, there are climate darlings, which are often those ones who already have a higher adaptive capacity, and some climate orphans, which I think needs to be discussed. On a subnational level, we also had several case studies and found when it comes to starting from the allocation and then going to the more concrete implementation, that the interventions and the choice of instruments are rarely really based on comprehensive risk assessment as is stated by German development cooperation. And this should be done to be really relevant and address beneficiaries' need. So secondly, I would also like to, before coming to the private sector, I would like to point out that in principle, German development cooperation emphasizes partner orientation as a guiding principle in the process of expanding also the adaptation portfolio. And as a result, however, we found that the ODA matches to some extent with partner orientation. So partner countries' sectoral priorities have had only limited influence on the actual distribution of adaptation funds so far. And a comparison of all adaptation funds in agriculture and food security sectors shows, for example, that there is already a high level of partner orientation, while the trend is much less pronounced, for example, in the field of biodiversity. So just to share also with you that the review of the assumption of partner orientation is based on the comparison with the NDCs and OECD CRS data. So in conclusion, we find that there's room for improvement. And last but not least, and this to be very brief, perhaps not surprising, we found that mobilizing private finance with German interventions looking at financial cooperation is low. So there's hardly any private funds that have been mobilized by financial cooperation receiving German ODA for climate adaptation. Perhaps I stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. We'll come back to maybe elaborate some of the mobilization question just in a little while. And but I'll take that question first to Theo, and from the perspective of the Multilateral Development Bank. We've just heard from a bilateral partner, but what have been some of the insights from the perspective of Multilateral Development Bank, particularly as you work related to energy and promoting sustainable and resilient and affordable energy systems, in particular as you in relation to catalyzing private sector financing? What have been the lessons that you're learning?
Yeah, of course. Is this on? Yeah, it is working. Okay. Always have to check that there's no technological glitch at the beginning of a session. So, as Archie said, my name is Theo Sands, and I come from the Independent Evaluation Department of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And at the EBRD, we kind of have a little bit of a unique role because we're the only multilateral development bank with a specific mandate to focus on the private sector. In terms of what that means, where we allocate our climate finance, we are a demand-led institution. So we are going and we are providing finance where we're seeing demand in the market, where we're seeing deals available. We also have to operate under the two principles that are sort of written into the agreement establishing the bank, our effective constitution, sound banking and additionality. And so sound banking implies that a project has to have a returnable capital component. Projects have to be bankable. And from an evaluation perspective, we've seen that where we have supported policy dialogue efforts to improve the bankability of climate mitigation and green finance projects, we have seen a big surge of both investment from the EBRD as well as from other development finance institutions, and in some cases from commercial finance as well. We also, though, are worried about additionality, and that's the other side of the coin, as it were, because we don't want to be crowding out private sector investors. And thus far, at least in the projects that have come under the scope of our evaluations, we have not yet seen much evidence in the countries where the EBRD operates that we are at risk of crowding out finance from commercial investment, because commercial investment in, for instance, renewable energy projects is not yet available at scale to support the green transition that the countries that we're working in need. I think going forward, though, there is going to be a risk that we need to be aware of, that we need to be sort of cognizant of. As an MDB, in working in climate finance, our role is to make the difficult, challenging, systemic investments. We don't want to be doing the easy things. And as renewable energy technologies demonstrate their viability, their feasibility, and their cost competitiveness with traditional sources of power generation, we need to make sure that we're stepping back enough to allow commercial market entrants into that space, to allow commercial financiers experience to support projects and to learn more about the role that they can be playing in climate financing and in supporting the green transition. And we need to be focusing on those more difficult investments, things like projects with public good components like national grid infrastructure, or projects which are still pushing technological innovation frontiers, such as in energy storage, or projects which may involve very complicated negotiations with different stakeholders, such as in decommissioning of hydrocarbon power plants. And so we have to be very careful that we're establishing that balance between finding projects which are bankable and which we can support, and supporting policy dialogue efforts to do so, but at the same time not crowding out commercial finance, because ultimately we do want to see commercial finance sort of going into the sector. I think besides our sort of direct financial support, the other big role we have as an MDB is in trying to tackle the barriers that both private sector investors and commercial financial institutions face in providing climate finance. And there's lots of different things going on here. There's informational barriers, with financial institutions not understanding the risks involved in climate financing. There's capacity. There's often regulatory barriers. Even yesterday I was speaking to someone from a commercial bank here in Egypt, and he was explaining that for the very large Egyptian solar complex in Benban down in southern Egypt, commercial banks would have very much wanted to be involved in the financing of that. But unfortunately, because of restrictions on FX lending for local Egyptian banks, they simply weren't able to. And that was something that we, from the evaluation perspective, have seen in many different countries, that commercial banks often want to be involved, would like to be involved, but cannot play a role because they're still facing policy barriers or regulatory constraints which make the provision of finance expensive or burdensome, and ultimately not worth it for either the financial provider nor the private sector recipient. And so as MDBs, we do also have I think a very critical role to play there in identifying those policy dialogue barriers and using both our political weight in engaging with governments, but also the funding that we have available to sort of support technical assistance programs to address those.
Thanks so much, Theo. That's very insightful in terms of how the MDB should be positioned, especially when it comes to comes to the private sector and crowding out versus crowding in of investments, especially in difficult markets that you might work in. Let's turn the conversation a little bit back to the GCF with Margaret Ann. Margaret Ann, you're the private sector observer at the GCF. You get a voice and just you get to speak at the board, unlike virtually all of us in the room. The GCF also has a very specific mandate on mobilizing private sector resources and working with the private sector. And in your day job, you also work with the private sector and sort of coordinate some of those responses. What have been some of the responses that or insights as you look at the GCF from the perspective of the private sector and the challenges or opportunities of accessing climate finance?
Thank you so much. And Archie, it's great to be here with you and Andreas and with the new colleagues, Alexandra and Theo. I think I'd like to provide some context, perhaps, for those that aren't very familiar. So my role as active private sector observer is I do get to sit in at the board meeting and make interventions on behalf of the private sector. I don't speak by my own, thank you. I don't speak on my own behalf. I speak really on behalf of the private sector, looking at and representing, and I often get to know the DAEs and the IEAs within the private sector that have private sector projects. Why? Because they all face similar barriers. Now, let's talk first of all. The GCF is mandated to include the private sector, but the private sector is not a monolithic. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not a big money bag. As well as you've got everything from large institutional banks as well as from small SMEs. And all of that, what I've seen and what we've seen is that the smaller the entity, the smaller, more like an SME, it's more disproportionate the access to the GCF because it costs more in terms of resources and time and energy as well as capacity. And so this is really, as much as the GCF is mandated and wants to include those most vulnerable and help those most vulnerable. In fact, the access to it is the same route to market for international accredited entities and DAs. And make no mistake, even if you're an IAE, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's that much easier for you either. There's large DAEs as well as small DAEs. But I think what's noticeable here is what the IEU has noticed is how very few private sector DAEs there are. And from the serving in this role for the past 3 years, and prior to that, it was my colleague that served for the previous 4 years, we have seen that it is just a very, very long time to become an accredited entity. So if a private sector entity wants to do that, they really have to think long and hard because it's a long, expensive road with no guarantees. And then once you become an accredited entity, there's no guarantees either as to if and when you will get funded. So a lot of, and I often ask, I ask pretty much every single DAE that I come into contact with, IAE or DAE, why? And they're often like, because the GCF is the only game in town that could allow us access on such a large level. Now, I know we have this simplified approval process, which is for smaller, which was $10 million and now has been raised to 25 million. But even that for the private sector we see less private sector entities going into this because the time, energy, and money in which it takes to actually gain accreditation and funding is the same amount of time that it takes for a much larger project. So one can see where they might not necessarily want to choose the simplified approval process because it's not really much more simple. This is our guarantee, what we're saying. I just had a few notes with regards to from a private sector perspective, as much as the GCF is meant to be capital agnostic, if we look at the results, there's very little equity. We finally got some guarantees. So the financial instruments that the private sector is used to is not necessarily really represented at the GCF. Now, some of this is to do with the first, funding approvals. Now they've got 200 different funding approvals that have come through, but approximately 30% of this is private sector. it is a long road in which a long learning road, and the GCF is a learning institution, and they're showing that. But from a private sector perspective, it is very difficult to engage and very difficult to keep, because those projects that private sector has, they don't stay stagnant in time for a year or 2 years or anything. And let's take, for example, the EBRD, who does wonderful work, is the private sector entity with the most projects, with the most funding from the GCF. And one, I would argue, and I see this, is because they actually understand both the UNFCCC processes as well as the private sector processes. So in some ways, they have this advantage of actually looking and figuring out the bridge between the two. But for a lot of private sector entities, they just don't have that bridge. And then when you add that into a developing nation economy, that's even a further barrier for capacity. So yes, there are tools, the private sector facility, but these are just hard, and they're just that bit more barrier for private sector. I've already probably gone on a bit more, but I hope that talks about the accesses. We find it hard, the private sector overall. I'm so happy that there's 3 DAEs here, and would love to speak with you afterwards. I'm available, and I just think part of why I serve in this role is we want to see more financial flows flowing in. There's not enough country government money. We all know that. So how do we help facilitate the financial flows that the private sector can bring with de-risking elements that the GCF has the capability of offering? Back over to you, Archie.
Thanks, Margaret. And so we're speaking of two sort of themes emerging among the panel members. So one is the access to institutions such as the GCF and how difficult that is, how related that is to capacity. And because of that very capacity, what you do with that finance, which is the mobilization of private finance, private sector finance further, is again challenging because of strategic positioning of these institutions and of that finance. I want to turn very quickly to the audience now and to elicit from you some of your experiences and insights or questions for our panel members, and share some of your thoughts and experiences as you've had them. Could you introduce yourself, Anne?
Hello, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Dirk Snyman. I work for the Pacific Community, SPC, which is a regional direct access entity in the Pacific, serving the 4 eligible Pacific SIDS that are eligible to Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund. I just wanted to firstly say thank you to the panelists. I think they were very good interventions, and probably a lot more honest than I expected to hear this afternoon. And it's unfortunate that we don't have more GCF Secretariat, ITAP and board members in the audience. I saw a number of them left the pavilion during this conversation. That's unfortunate. I think this would have been better directed to them perhaps than to some of us. So we have an experience that we've got 2 projects that have been approved for our SIDS, including one enhancing direct access project. And we have the experience that, for example, the Adaptation Fund, our colleague is here, is a lot more nimble, more effective, and I think that's been something that we've been hearing through all the discussions, the negotiations, etc. So just to commend you for that and thank you for that. And that's really a model that we'd like to see the GCF moving towards as well. My question or comment is to Andreas. Firstly, to say, also to you, a special thanks. I think the IEU's work is really excellent, and I promise you someone does read the reports, even if it's only me. Someone is reading them out there. They're very well structured. I think they're really excellent. When you look at how old those reports are and which sort of recommendations have been implemented, just looking at the ones that we find particularly relevant. So the one on RFPs, 17 months, the one on adaptation, 21 months. So sort of everyone's proud of their babies by this stage, I think, if we put it into those terms. The SIDS one is now 2 years old, and the SAP one is now 2.5 years old. And I need to read much more of the board documents than I have, but I think that from our perspective, the only major change that we've seen, really taking these into consideration, is the upgrade of the SAP from 10 million to 25 million, which in our opinion is the least useful of the recommendations that you made. So no consideration of the category going from C to B, no consideration of changing how the approvals go, etc., etc. So this is, sorry, a lot of background, but these are the things that we're constantly discussing, what we're hearing from our countries, sort of their requests to us the whole time. And we're always the go-between. So when they're upset with us for not getting their projects quickly. And obviously, you know, there's a little we can do about that. I have two questions to you. So the first one is, what do you see? I don't know if you can even answer this. What do you see as being the barriers to getting all these really good recommendations, all of the conclusions and everything from the reports? What are the barriers from getting that through? We've had 12 board meetings plus since some of these reports have been released. And we've seen, okay, you can get 25 million instead of 10 million for a SAP. Except a SAP only takes 19 days fewer through the board process than a full funding proposal, in which case the countries say, we'd rather have 40 million in a category B than 10 million or 25 in a category C. So what do you see as being the main challenges related to getting all of these excellent recommendations into policy? And a second quick question, because you mentioned the entity work programs or entity work plans and the GCF country programs. Countries also have NDCs, they've got NAPs, they've got NAPAs, they've got NAMAs, they've got all of these things going way back. And now we saw the launch of the Climate Investment Plan just the other day. So what do I need to, or what's your view, maybe you can't speak on behalf of the Secretariat, what's your view on the shifting goalposts in terms of plans, programs, whatever else that countries need to have? You know, what do I need to go back and tell countries who just finished their new updated country program this year, and I have to say to them, sorry guys, you need a climate investment plan as well. So yeah, I'd be interested in your views on that. Sorry for the long intervention, but these are daily issues that we're having with our countries. Thank you.
Not at all long, actually. Very specific one. Yes, let's give him a big hand. So, and very useful intervention there about, and two questions for Andres, how to make evaluations useful and that's actually a question for, perhaps it's a lesson to be learned from other evaluation offices as well. But any other insights to follow that one? Any other questions?
I need to introduce myself again. My name's Charles Reeve. I work for a company called Tetra Tech International Development in Europe. There's many questions I could ask, but I want to ask in a capacity. I've spent the last 10 years managing an FCDO program in Southern Africa called the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Development Facility. And we have been working with transboundary river basin organizations to develop what I would call climate resilient investment plans, particularly around water sector. And I think we all understand the importance of water in the context of climate adaptation. I was in workshops in Southern Africa last month with these organizations, talking about how they would access finance. And of course, accessing finance with the GCF was top of the agenda. Many of the points Andres has made, I think, came across in that. You know, would I advise them to become accredited? Not if it takes you 3.5 years, no. But what are the options? So I guess my question, and I won't go on any further, is what about these regional organizations that are tackling transboundary water issues? In the case of the biggest one of those in Southern Africa, the Zambezi Watercourse Commission, 8 countries, basin that has got 60% of the basin degraded, many people in poverty. They are in the process of developing climate resilient development plans. They need financing. How do they access finance from the GCF? What should they be doing to access finance from the GCF? The key being, it's a regional entity, it's not a country. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. How to access finance? Andres, very tough questions coming your way. Any other insights from the audience? Any other reflections you might want to share? We've gone to both ends of the room. I'm looking at the middle now. Let's keep the dialogue.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I've got many more questions or comments, but I don't want to hog the microphone. I had a question for I think it was Alexandra, who mentioned that I can't recall exactly what your wording was, but around the importance of having higher per capita allocations of finance for SIDS and LDCs. I think that's more or less what you said. I wasn't taking notes as you said it. We're finding, obviously in SIDS, in the Pacific and the Caribbean and elsewhere, everything's just super expensive. We've got to get the stuff from, wherever, from China, ship it through Australia, then it goes to Fiji, and then you can get it to Vanuatu or the Solomon Islands, something like that. And yet when we bring proposals to GCF particularly, we're just told it's too expensive, particularly on the mitigation side. They flat out refuse to fund mitigation, even though the countries have highly ambitious NDCs of full renewable, not 5% reduction over whatever, but fully renewable by 2030. And we can't get mitigation funding for that. I would be interested in any views or thoughts you have on why it's a recognized principle that the costs of adaptation and also mitigation are higher in LDCs and SIDS than perhaps in more developed countries or continental contexts or whatever. And if that is something that could somehow be addressed in terms of, I've got no understanding of economics or any of that kind of stuff, but if there's some kind of way of developing benchmarks or economic indicators, we keep getting told that our projects don't meet the benchmark, but when we ask what the benchmark is, that comment gets deleted from the review sheet and then the review sheet gets sent back to us. So it would be interesting if you've got a view on whether there could be some kind of benchmarks or something like that that could take this into account.
Thank you. Before any other reflections from the audience, from the floor, before we turn to the panel for their quick feedback? Okay, Andres, over to you. Lots of difficult questions your way.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks again for engaging so nicely with us. I may start with you on your wonderful presentation of how many months it's been since we've completed the different evaluations. I like that actually. Look, from our perspective as an evaluation office, there were a couple of things that we needed to put in place, and we are very lucky to have put them in place this year and last year. We were able to draft, after many revisions and almost 3 years of policy work, an evaluation policy for the GCF. And that's an evaluation policy that's not only a policy to inform our own work, but also the work of the Secretariat and the work of the accredited entities, to define what sort of things should be considered when thinking about the principles for evaluation and when thinking about the criteria for evaluation and thinking about the types of knowledge sharing that would happen with this. And fortunate part there was to also identify what would happen for board consideration. So all these different types of evaluations do not necessarily enter the board. The IEU evaluations do enter the board because we have the mandate to inform the decision making of the board. So our evaluations go directly to the board. And here we are, where we need to consider how can we make them policy relevant? How can we make them also relevant in the discussions that are happening at board level? And how can we get the board to decide? Let me come with the last first. We have done in this round, this year, a study on the updated strategic plan, and we looked at the policy gaps only. So we looked at the strategic plan and all the policies that were mentioned in the GCF. There were about 18. Only 2 were addressed when you checked it earlier this year in the entire period for GCF1. That's very little. So we have definitely a policy gap, a lack of addressing policies at the board level, no doubt. And that in itself is also hindering evaluations to become more effective, in recommendations to become more effective, because there's essentially very little that has been done in policy work. That has improved since, again. We've made a presentation, we made the board members, we made it clear to the board members that there is a lot of policy work that needs to be done for this programming period, and some of these policies have been addressed. So that's good, but not so good because we haven't seen it. The second part to this, and that relates a little bit more to how we bring it forward, we would always want a good, a structured way of how evaluations would be looked at. Generally speaking, evaluations can be informative, can be for learning for the board, not necessarily for the accountability. but there are other evaluations that are more for the accountability. Now the question is, how do you get the board to decide on this? And we would always want the board to look at the evaluations, look at the management response, and take these two documents on board, and then provide policy direction to the secretariat or to whomever in the GCF where it's directed. That's not always happening. So the board has also been has also had difficulties in the past in providing direction and a vision to what should be tackled next. And that these are, you know, just to name those two, these are some of the things that have happened and have obviously had also impacts on the evaluation work. Lastly, I think we improved as well over time to look at evaluations a lot more from a perspective of collective learning with the secretariat together. We go to the secretariat, we want to engage with them, we want to see and how this would work. So some of the things that we were discussing about SAP have been filtering through to the new template that's currently being drafted for the SAP process. These processes are again slow; they are not there yet. It will take a little bit of time till we see it. But what we see is that the secretary is actively discussing some of these things that have taken on. Same for the SPR. We had an event earlier this morning. The strategic planning for the GCF period 2 does consider some of these findings that we have in the second performance review. So I think it's coming. It's just not as visible, and there's not policy, you know, for every little program and tool that we have. Okay, then to the entity work programs and country programs, and the climate the country investment plan as it is now. Yeah, here our evidence shows very clearly we need to think about how first of all, how relevant are these documents? How can we get countries to use them? Are these relevant? We know exactly, as you said, we know there are NDCs, there are NAPs, there are other national strategies for climate. I've just recently visited Kenya. That Kenya, as an example, has a wonderful strategy for climate. It bears the question: do we need an additional document? Is that really necessary? Then the second part is also, and how can we incentivize the country to then do that as well? Because most often when we hear conversations on the ground in the countries, people are referring to the fact and say, like, Andreas, why would I want to do a country program? I have all these documents. Of course, you're providing funding through our PSP, but what am I going to do with this at the end? It's an international consultant that will do the work, and then it will not end up in anything meaningful. And that's right, because there is no incentive to do anything, because on the other end, there's also no targets, no clarity on how much money would be available for potential projects or project pipeline. For the entity work programs is similar. So we are at the IEU, we're saying the GCF secretariat should consider if these documents are still relevant, and if there's not something else that should be done instead. The country investment plan, well, we're yet to see if this is really just a new cover for the same story, or if it's something else. So it's very hard to say at this point. So we'll have to wait a little bit. Charles, on to your questions. And thanks again for those ones as well. And you know, just last week I was at the Wetlands Convention in Geneva. The stories about wetlands, the stories about waterways is a huge one. It's a huge ecosystem, and we consider it one of the largest ecosystem service area when we think about adaptation. So truly important. What can we do in terms of private sector with it, and how does the private sector link to this? You're absolutely right. We've just had yesterday a side event on private sector, where I had to come up with 5 things that I would want to say that needs to happen in order to get private sector on board. One is we need to start thinking about being a catalyst. I think for financing from GCF perspective, we can't go on with leverage. That was one of the stories that we said. You know, the GCF has both mandates, leverage and and being the catalyst, providing catalytic funding. But we have far too much looked at the leverage end, and we need to think about the catalytic aspect of our funding more. The second thing that we said is finance should be far more local. We need to involve local private sector. We need to start engaging with those. Again, a mandate of the GCF, we've not done enough with this. The private sector strategy, and these are findings from the private sector evaluation. The private sector strategy was one of the results out of the private sector evaluation that we've done. The private sector strategy now says the GCF in the future is going to concentrate on 4 things. It's looking at the question of de-risking, definitely de-risking projects, and that's linking very well to these points that I just made. But it also thinks about the first move on first loss. So when you have a fund like you were describing, and you want other funders to come in, the GCF does feel is positioned well enough to become that first investor that takes the first losses as well. And then what also the GCF has said as a third as a fourth thing is engaging with the local private sector. So trying to link it more to where it is. These are the things that are coming out from the discussions on the private sector strategy right now at the Secretariat, and that's quite promising. How to overcome accreditation? The only answer that we hear from the Secretariat, and we yet to see if this would work, is PSAA, and that's the project-specific assessment approach, which would circumvent the question of accreditation at the GCF. We're yet to see what this really means. We have not seen any projects in that point through that system. Was that long? Thanks. Over to you, Archie.
Thank you, Andres. That is quite an insightful explanation into many dimensions of the GCF that you're thinking about at the unit and we're thinking about at the unit. There's also an emerging sort of discourse here that's quite tangible, which is that we have all these lessons from challenges to access. We have all these lessons from evaluations, etc. But it is challenging to have decision makers take up those lessons. So just before we turn to the question to Alexandra about mobilizing, but I want to come back. I would eventually, just after we take the intervention from Alexandra, come back to Theo and to Margaret Ann. Theo, you work in an evaluation office, and Margaret Ann, you work directly with the board as an observer. Any insights or suggestions you might have to inform the decision making of boards, of your respective boards, from the various kinds of interventions that you make? What do we do with all this evidence and knowledge if we can't influence decision making? But before that, let me turn to Alexandra about the question that our colleague from SPC asked about vulnerability and access.
So yeah, thank you for your question. Very good one indeed. So yeah, we just in our portfolio and allocation study, we just assessed. We had the claim or the strategy or the assumption that German Development Cooperation is supporting the most vulnerable people and countries. That is stated. And we found that the level of vulnerability is not reflected in the amount of commitments. However, we did not do a second study on costs of adaptation, but I like the idea. And I also find that this up to now is not an idea very much reflected in the discussions on how to disperse, how to commit, how to allocate the available funds. So I think this excellent idea, but I think this is perhaps something in a second step that will come. I'm also happy to hear from the colleagues what they think about it. And however, up to now, we also find that there is no German strategy on climate change adaptation for development cooperation, similarly as you find a lack of strategies. So that could nicely fit into that if it ever comes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in on the challenges of making evaluation useful and used, which is actually the vision statement of our evaluation department as of last year. So it's great that I'm able to market that and get that out there. I think this starts off from the very beginning of the process and the actual selection of topics for evaluation, and trying to make sure that we select the most relevant and useful topics out there. I think my colleagues at DVAL and at the GCF will, agree with me that evaluation departments typically do not have the resources to be able to comprehensively assess a wide institution's portfolio. We have to selectively target areas which we think will be the most relevant and which we think will be the most useful. And part of that whole process is engaging with stakeholders, both internally and externally, to understand where their pain points are, where, processes are taking too long, where things aren't working, and, where it might be sort of worth looking at, as well as what decisions are coming up in the future. Where is an institution facing a big decision-making process that we can feed into and that we can influence? And that goes back to, I think, the second key component of how to be useful and used and how to make boards take up our recommendations, which is just making sure that we're timely, and that making sure that our evaluations are produced in time to influence into a decision. It's no use having a board release a new strategy and then a month later the evaluation turn up with a fancy new report with lovely illustrations and great recommendations, because it's done and dusted, the story is over. And so understanding what's on their horizon, what they're looking at, what they're going to be looking at in 6, 12, 18 months' time, and how we can proactively feed into that is a really important part of that whole process. Feasibility. We've recently introduced a new step in our evaluation process of sitting down with management before an evaluation goes to board and discussing the recommendations with them, and just trying to get a sense of what the feasibility constraints are, particularly in the situation that the EBRD is, where we're working with private sector actors and we are responsive to a market environment. There are constraints that in terms of what we can and cannot do. But at the same time, I think a part of being useful and a part of pushing the board and getting recommendations accepted is being a bit challenging in our recommendations too. We don't want to issue recommendations which are going to be 100% accepted by management every single time. I think that would be a little bit of a failure of ambition on our part. It would suggest that we're not being provocative enough and pushing them enough in what we're doing. And so, having recommendations which cause people to sort of sit up and think a bit too. Maybe not everything will get accepted, but I think that's ultimately a way too of boosting our own credibility and boosting the uptake of our lessons and findings more generally. But it is an ongoing challenge that, I think we all face.
Thanks so much. And following on from what Theo was saying, it's the private sector strategy. It's very interesting because you talked about the de-risking, the first mover, first loss, engaging with the private sector and accreditation. Now, engaging with the private sector, the Secretariat has done that, but there's been a lot of talk, and it is a lot of talk and a lot more talk. And exactly as the gentleman said here, Dirk? Yeah, exactly as the gentleman, Dirk said, it's backwards and forwards, and the private sector really just doesn't always know. It feels like there's another hoop, another barrier. And by the way, it's not just the private sector. Public sector says the same thing. So it's very difficult. So if there were recommendations, would be a consistency, if at all possible, which I know is not always possible. I think the Secretariat tries to be, but there is this inconsistency in approach, or sometimes, and I've heard this several times from several IEAs, DAEs that say that it just comes back, and it comes back in a loop, and it comes back, and that has to deal sometimes with the Secretariat changing, the people, etc. But this lack of consistency, it just adds more time. And so the second point would be timeliness. Yes, I know the accreditation period has shortened some. Yes, I know that the funding proposal has shortened some, but it is really a long, hard process. And again, for private sector companies, it's very difficult, particularly for those, and even public sector, but for those that want to crowd in investors, and they're waiting. So when will you get the money? And you can't really tell them. And not only that, you just don't know. And then the third point would be around these instruments. As much as we say that the GCF wants to do these de-risking projects and first mover and first loss, we just saw the first guarantee that came through at the last board meeting, which caused an enormous amount of controversy on the board. And what I've noticed as the observer is that whenever there's a new thing, and EBRD had one that embedded carbon markets within it over a 7 country programmatic approach. Every time there's something new, it is really very difficult and a long, hard process at the board and a lot of fights. And if the board, really wants these programs, so it's a question of overall, my fun thing would be decide the board, what type of private sector do you want? Because what we're hearing is they want more DAE access, fine. But then you're going to be prepared to do lots of smaller projects, period. It's just not possible. You can't have large scale programs like we did with the Green Guarantee Company that come in and have a small DAE do that. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the authority as well. So if you want these IEA projects, then, which can help the risk, then we're going to need what type of private sector do they want? And, the final point is just the design of the fund is, if you think about it, the private sector facility is the same as the DMA, meaning it's fighting for the same amount of money. It's under the same legal structure. Everything is it's the GCF. But if you want a private sector facility that is designed for the private sector, then should there be, should we consider in fact that there is a demarcation, a delineation, such that it is encouraging either perhaps more streamlined for the private sector, something that allows for obviously the integrity of the projects and programs, but that also provides a better access or a more streamlined access, or let's say for the DAEs, something easier for them, or more help or more capacity building. Because one last point that I'll leave you with is that I don't know any project, and I don't know every single project, but that hasn't had to hire consultants. No entity, no direct access entity or IE is unable to write that project, that final funding proposal, and get it submitted without a bunch of people. And that's a lot of money behind that. And this is kind of the counterintuitive to what the GCF wants to do, which is allow access to finance. And yet it costs you a lot of money to have access to the finance that you want. And how does one do that? And I know I'm being slightly controversial here, but at the same time, it's really, I see this with the entities that go through. It's very difficult. There's a lot of hard work. There's no guarantees. Of course, there's no guarantees in life anyway, but it is disproportionate for smaller DAs. It is infinitely disproportionate in terms of time, money, energy, and effort, which is exactly not what the GCF wants to do. So if you want private sector money, and I would highly encourage it, obviously talking from the private sector, but we can leverage, there's a lot of innovation that comes with a lot of can-do attitude, a lot of private sector is there to make things happen and to deliver on this. There's a certainly absolutely time necessary for grants, etc. But when we want to grow a market and we want to gain access and build something, we want to build something that's long lasting and that can actually leverage and build a repeatable business model. And I think this is one of the things that the GCF could look at to build for the private sector side. Absolutely, we need to stay integral to the countries and to those that need adaptation and those most vulnerable, but really for having a private sector facility that is fit for purpose is really something that I think should be considered. And your evaluations have been great, the IEU. So congrats again, Archie and Andreas, on that. Back over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Margaret, and you actually spoke about cost of project preparation as well. And one of the things we've said in one of the evaluations is based on the feedback from a colleague in an international entity. And they said for a GCF project, for a multi-country project, it costs them $400,000 extra per country relative to what it might cost them for preparation of projects for other entities. So GCF projects per country cost them $400,000 extra per country for project preparation. And that's quite outrageously resource intensive. Any other feedback that we might have from the floor, to the panel, to each other, any lessons we might want to share? or the panel members if you want to ask each other any questions that you might be curious about.
Sorry, I did warn you, but no one else is putting up their hands. This is for Margaret. Yes. So I was intrigued in what you were saying, and particularly the costs for private sector. So just to make it clear, we're not a private sector, we're public sector intergovernmental organization. We're only accredited for grants, so we can't do all the loans and all the fancy like financial instruments and all that kind of stuff. There is a huge appetite in the Pacific. I get called every 3 months into some private sector climate finance regional workshop, Melanesian Spearhead Group or whatever. Like there's always a bunch of stuff going on. They're extremely eager to access climate finance and GCF particularly. There's a huge appetite, but they have the same things that you said. They just say it's too slow, the accreditation is an issue, etc., etc. The project-specific accreditation is one opportunity perhaps, although I heard from some entities in the region that they just want to let their accreditation lapse and then just do PSAs every time for the projects rather than go through re-accreditation. So that's interesting. But the big challenge that we have is our private sector is very small. I mean, firstly, everyone says, oh, the private sector, like it's someone with a business card and you can just go to the private sector, you know, where their offices are downtown. It's not like that. And in the Pacific particularly, the private sector is not Walmart's or like whatever, some big bank or something like that. The private sector is the guy shining the shoes on the streets in Suva and the lady selling her mangoes at the local market. When we speak to people, including in GCF, and we say, how do we include these types of things? The answer we got once was, oh, well, they can be beneficiaries of projects as well. Well, in that case, everyone is. The smallholder farmer that we're working with is the fisher folk, they're a private sector. I'd be interested in your perspectives from the board. I think you've had more exposure than we would have had on where you see maybe opportunities for, you know, really small scale micro enterprises, where there would be opportunities both for providing them benefits, but somehow, you know, aggregating them in some way to be able to have some kind of investment power or something. I don't know. And then second, how to address this issue that, as everyone says, by the time you've got halfway through an accreditation process, your priorities in the private sector have changed. Never mind, you know, the 3 years for accreditation, then 5 years to get a project approved. In 8 years' time, no one's listening to you anymore. The private sector have stopped speaking to you. Governments are still there, but private sector's obviously not. So I'd be very interested in insights from that perspective.
Thank you. And in fact, those are the beneficiaries, or ultimately the reason why we're here is for the vulnerability of these communities, the fruit seller by the side of the road in a sense, right? Alexandra, we might also ask you about if you have any insights on mobilization of private sector finance and vulnerability, because those are the two dimensions you spoke of. But let's first turn to Margaret Ann. Any reflections from the board on the pulse that you're getting off the board with related to these dimensions?
Yeah, Dirk, thank you so much. And again, I'm so glad you brought this point up, because you bring up the point of who is the private sector, and it is not the same. And particularly in small and developing states, the private sector needs help. You know, exactly. You know, they need help with food and water and energy access, all of these things so they can't create this enabling environment. In fact, the government or the municipality has to help create that. So I'm very much aware of the. Now, with regards to, I'm not surprised people are interested, and I do think there is something to be said for the aggregation, because one of the issues of working, let's say, in a SID, and even if it was is exactly as it's smaller. So for a larger institution, in order to come in and it's the same amount of due diligence that's required for a small project than for a large. And so that's why, the larger organizations just won't touch it unless it's aggregated, which is why I think one of the things that the GCF can do and has done through this are creating these funds within funds that then institutional investors can either co-invest in, and it's de-risked. But it is a real issue, and we're very much aware of this, and I think this is something that I think the GCF is trying to do. But it's hard because those projects still have to come through. You know, this is again, was it somebody was talking about demand-led? You got to remember though, the GCF, it's what the funding proposals are coming at them. Now they have issued requests for proposals. In fact, they did one. I think I'm going to misquote this, maybe back in 2017 for the private sector for the private sector, and it was oversubscribed. There were like 305 different proposals that came through. 20 were shortlisted. I think 2 have actually been funded. It was a learning process. But my point is that the things that they want, you know, maybe it needs to come more from a request for proposal. However, I do know that the Secretariat and the private sector facility, you know, they're working hard with direct access entities, with AIEAs to help create these funding proposals that are where the GCF wants to go, what the aspirations are. So this is really a work in progress. They've really become a partner institution. And I think this is something that obviously I don't know if you deal directly with DMA or the PSF, I'm guessing DMA, but this is something that I think should be addressed, and particularly for the SIDS. With regards to your last point for priorities, I think the GCF has these different priorities, but I think maybe it needs to be articulated better. And shared better. And so we realize around this communication issue, which this lovely lady who I believe is a DAE as well, is, you know, has brought up. So I don't have the necessary answers, but I do think that communication back and forth is really important. And I take your point, and I'm so glad you raised it with regards to the private sector, because sometimes, let me just give you an example, you know, they don't want private sector to have any grant. Private sector, no grant access. Oh, but you're like, but they need, you know, if you're going to jumpstart something, or if you're going to help protect, if this enabling environment or this grant component could be there to help create capacity, build capacity. So one has to kind of think about what are we looking to achieve, and then what are the instruments we need to do that, rather than, okay, it's private sector so that we can't have this, or the private sector DAs, then they have to go through an entity that can accept some type of a grant component and put that in. And it's not that private sector is looking for grant money so much as looking is how do we make the project work in the long run. And I think these are the things that we need to discuss with. And I'll stop here. Maybe you've got more to add.
Alexandra, any insights from your side on vulnerable communities and private sector?
Thank you. Perhaps I'm afraid I also don't have the silver bullet and the necessary answer to the question. We just found that for adaptation and only looking at financial cooperation, this to say it really has hardly been achieved. So really hardly any private money mobilized. And also, I mean, we have talked a lot about that it takes time, money, what else, energy for the private in the face of the GCF. But there's also holds true for, if you look at the programming cycle of financial cooperation in Germany, which is easily several years before you come to the implementation. So also a similar story, I would say. I mean, just to mention, our study was including data which didn't reflect the last years. So OECD, CRS data could be updated, but still, right now, for example, with a strong German commitment to the newly launched global shield for protection, including, for example, climate disaster risk financing instruments as one of the key components, and a very strong commitment of German government to invest in. There might be some evolution, I trust, but this is still in its infancy, and there's a lot still in the conceptual phase. Actually, so much that for evaluations we really had to take a formative perspective, really focus very strongly on the learning aspect. That might perhaps come to other conclusions, but early for an evaluation to come up with really sound evidence on that point.
Theo, might you have any perspective? The EBRD has been, like you said in your first intervention, about being in risky markets and taking risks, especially in contexts and geographies where the private sector would otherwise not go automatically. Any insights related to that?
Yeah, and I was going to say a lot of the issues that Dirk was describing are things that we see too, in terms of a range of different private sector actors, and we cannot directly ourselves reach the smallest of SMEs, and also a range of different contexts that we operate in. So, investing in Poland is not the same as investing in Central Asia. There are different sets of challenges involved in the more difficult contexts. And we've had two sort of initiatives launched which have addressed some of these. The first is the Early Transition Countries Initiative, which was a targeted program at the set of countries where investment was most difficult and where our average investment size was much lower than it was in the rest of the portfolio. We basically accepted that in those countries, we were going to have to accept higher transaction costs relative to investment in order to get things going. The other thing that we do in terms of trying to reach small companies which we can't reach directly is lending via financial intermediaries. And we have a lot of very successful programs with targeted credit lines for on-lending, including on-lending specifically for green finance. One of the most successful programs that we've had recently is the Green Economy Financing Facility, which provides loans to local banks to on-lend for specific green projects with local SMEs. But we also have similar programs for on-lending to, more sort of generic on-lending to SMEs, on-lending to women-led businesses, microfinance, and so on and so forth. And that's been quite an effective vehicle for us to continue channeling funds into the real economy, to sort of, try and make sure that some of our finance is reaching, smaller enterprises without making them sort of jump through lots of hoops and incur transaction costs both on their side and on our side. Because feasibly, we can't be reaching a very small, company with only a handful of employees. That doesn't make sense for them or for us. But what we can do is we can provide a loan to a local bank who can reach them. And both of those have been, relatively successful ways in which we've been able to extend our reach a little bit further and reach smaller businesses in more difficult places. Yeah.
Thanks, Theo. Let's also get a perspective from Dastan.
First of all, thank you very much for all the panelists for wonderful insights and comments. From the morning, I am participating in a couple of sessions, and I already asked my question as well from operational point of view. But now I wanted to ask a question about structural point of view. Words come to my mind that did you evaluate possibilities somehow to open maybe regional offices around the world in order to help, especially when it comes to capacity building? It's very hard to understand all those things and new policies within GCF. That kind of possibilities are there, or did you have any evaluation on it? I'm not suggesting, but just asking, of course. Yeah, thank you.
Regional offices and capacity. A very delicious question for the GCF. Any other reflections? Actually, we might turn to Andres then for the final comments as well. So just want to combine any other questions here.
Thank you very much for these excellent presentations. As you know, job creation is almost the private sector. In your evaluation, did you get how many money has been channeled, in particular for the private sector in the Africa region? Thank you.
Africa region, job creation, any evidence related to job creation, particularly in the Africa region, if you found any evidence? Maybe I'll direct that question to you, Alexandra, and to you, Theo, if you might have any evidence from your evaluations. If you want to take a moment.
Sorry, so this is related, or maybe an add-on to that, the question that you asked about regional presence for GCF. So my add-on to that would be, and if so, what would the added value of that be, given that Directorate of the Division of Country Programming are our best friends and are very supportive, very understanding of us, and we find that the barriers lie beyond that. So putting them into regions or something, what would the added value of that be, given that, again, the decisions would still be made in Korea anyway? So would there be a possibility to...
so regional presence related to capacity, but also other dimensions. And if we might not find a resolution to Africa and job creation within the few evaluations we have before us, we do have the independent evaluation unit is doing an evaluation on the GCF investments in the on African states, and we're presenting some preliminary findings from that evaluation next week. And maybe that'll be. I don't know the contents of that evaluation yet, and might that consider. It might be a good plug to put in for that evaluation, but we're towards the end of our time. Let me turn to Andres before we close for that response on the regional presence and other questions that have come up.
Yeah, maybe on the Africa evaluation, you don't then have to act surprised. You're really truly surprised when you see it, Archie. Colleagues, yes, excellent questions. On the regional offices, that's obviously a very hypothetical question. You may know or may not know about the ins and out of the board discussions there, but the board, there's certain parts of the board that do not want to see regional presence. Other parts of the board do want to see regional presence. So there is that difference in vision and approach. We ourselves have not evaluated regional presence at all. We have also not done that, to look ahead in a forward-looking way. But what we have done in 2018, we've done an RPSP evaluation, so the readiness evaluation, the first of its kind, the readiness evaluation on the readiness program, and just for all your knowledge and reflection, in 2018 the GCF actually had something similar. It had regional advisors that were placed in the different regions where the GCF was acting, and those regional advisors were there to create the awareness about the fund and provide initial feedback on what might be needed or what can be, and how processes are going and what needs to be done in order to access the fund. Very interestingly, the evaluation, the RPSP evaluation back then found that unfortunately the regional advisors had very little opportunity to travel within the region. So while they were sitting in the region, they couldn't travel in the region. So there were some operational limitations that made the entire model be very, very restrictive. If we were to think for 1 second, what that would mean for a regional office model, we're running into the same questions. What would that regional office look like? Would the people be able to displace themselves within the region to visit the actors in the region? Would people have to come to that office? These are all sorts of questions, as well as, of course, as you mentioned, the reporting lines. Decision making would still have to be done in the GCF secretariat here in Songdo, South Korea, or are there any other chances? So these are all hypothetical questions that one would have to address and assess to come to a very a comprehensive conclusion about what that might look like, and if that is indeed a feasible option. I see your hand over there. I'll just go to job creation really quickly. Job creation from our perspective, the GCF, we've done an evaluation on the environmental and social safeguards, and that was done in 2019. What we looked at during that time is at the environmental and social policy of the GCF, a very progressive document that points out that we should be going beyond a do not harm rule to a proactive, positive social and environmental performance measurement. And what we meant by this is we should be looking at co-benefits of projects more closely. And when we look at social co-benefits of projects, we should be looking at job creation, because it is true that projects, even climate projects, would have to have some sort of indicators and some sort of thinking around what else are we bringing to the table other than addressing climate needs. Are we creating sustainability through those co-benefits? Yes or no? And job creation would be one part of that. That's what we found back then, that there was very little about co-benefits that was being done at the development stage and at the implementation stage. So unfortunately, the GCF is not yet ready to talk about job creation to that level, while other funds may be as well, maybe ready to speak about that. The GCF is not. I'll give it back to you. Thanks, Archie.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everyone. So today we started with covering access to the GCF, but we went down we opened multiple avenues. We talked about capacity as a challenge to accessing the GCF and climate finance. More broadly, we spoke about vulnerability as an attribute of accessing climate finance, about the role of private sector mobilization and how to do it and how challenging that might be and what role institutions could play. We also spoke about accessing the board of the GCF and how to inform, with all of this evidence and this knowledge, to inform the decision making of the board and then to persuade the decision making that all of us expect. Ultimately, that tells us that access is a multifaceted problem. It's not just about one lever or one switch that we need to turn on, but it goes right through the model and the institution, and how complex this little word, this 5-letter word or 6-letter word, is access. Thank you so much. Hopefully it's been of use to you as the first week of this COP comes to an end. Next week, the Independent Evaluation Unit has several other events in this pavilion as well as in other pavilions, where we're discussing, for instance, vulnerable countries and access, and we're discussing Africa and the private sector as well. So look forward to having some more of these discussions and the dialogue. Thank you so much for spending the time today with us.
And thank you, Archie, for shepherding us along. Thank you very much as well.